story #1 basement smell. I first noticed the smell on a Tuesday morning in late March. The snow had finally melted that weekend, and the temperature had climbed into the mid-60s, which felt almost tropical after weeks of gray cold. I was making coffee in my kitchen when I caught it. Something sweet and chemical, like acetone or paint thinner, seeping up through the bathroom drain. I didn't think much of it. Old buildings in Pittsburgh leak, pipes corrode. Upstairs neighbors use cleaning products. I opened a window and went about my day. By Wednesday, the smell was stronger. It had moved beyond the bathroom and into the hallway outside my bedroom. I kept telling myself it was just the warmth pulling old odors out of the walls, the kind of thing that happens in spring. I'd lived in this ground floor unit for 3 years without major problems. The building was old, 1920-something, brick and plaster, but it was solid. I'd chosen it specifically because I work from home as a freelance graphic designer and needed quiet. The rent was reasonable. The landlord was distant but responsive. By Thursday, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The smell had become almost visible, a presence in the apartment that made my eyes water. It clung to my hair and clothes. I'd wake up smelling it on my pillow. That's when the migraines started, the kind I get maybe once a month, usually triggered by stress or weather changes. But this was different. The smell seemed to trigger them directly, a chemical assault that made my temples throb and my vision swim. I packed my laptop and spent Friday and Saturday working from a coffee shop downtown, coming home only to sleep. I tried everything. I poured bleach down the drain. I left towels stuffed over the drain opening. I opened every window in the apartment, even though it was still cool at night. The smell didn't diminish. If anything, it got worse. And it wasn't coming from the drain anymore. That's when I realized it was coming from the walls themselves. The smell was strongest near the bathroom mirror, a large, frameless mirror mounted directly to the wall above the sink. I noticed it on Sunday morning while brushing my teeth. The odor seemed to radiate from behind the glass, thick and cloying. I also noticed something else, a thin gap between the mirror's edge and the wall. Not much. Maybe a 1/4 inch. But I'd lived here long enough to know that gap hadn't been there before. I was cleaning the sink when I saw the dust. Fine white powder on the edge of the porcelain, the kind you get from drywall when you drill. Just a small amount, but enough to make my stomach tighten. I looked more carefully at the mirror frame. The dust was concentrated near the top corners. I don't know why I decided to pull the mirror away from the wall. Some combination of curiosity and dread, I guess. The kind of feeling you get when you know something is wrong, but you're not quite ready to understand what it is. The mirror was heavier than I expected. I had to grip it carefully and angle it away from the wall, my heart already moving faster than it should have been. Behind the mirror, the drywall was white and smooth, recently patched, and there, arranged in a loose triangle, were 3 holes. Clean holes, maybe a 1/4 inch in diameter. Fresh plaster dust still clung to the edges, and I could see the metal marks where a drill bit had bitten into the wall. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, just staring. My brain was trying to construct a rational explanation. Maybe the landlord had sent someone to check the plumbing behind the wall. Maybe there was some kind of structural issue I didn't know about. Maybe this was normal and I was being paranoid. Then I noticed the medicine cabinet. It was mounted on the wall to the left of the sink, and I'd opened it 1,000 times without really looking at it. Now I pulled it open and looked at the back panel. 2 more holes. Same size, Same fresh dust, my hands were shaking. I went to the bathroom vent, the exhaust cover in the ceiling, and pulled down the ladder to get a closer look. The screws holding it in place didn't match the others throughout the apartment. The old screws were painted over, part of the original installation. These were new, shiny, recently installed. I sat on the bathroom floor for a while. I don't know how long. The chemical smell seemed to intensify around me, or maybe I was just noticing it more. I kept thinking about the holes. About someone in my apartment while I was at the coffee shop. About someone drilling into my walls and then carefully patching them, trying to hide what they'd done. About the ventilation system being modified for some reason I couldn't understand. I took photographs with my phone. Close-ups of the holes, the dust, the new screws. My hands were still shaking. I called my landlord 3 times. He didn't answer. I left a message saying it was urgent and hung up. Then I packed a bag. Clothes, laptop, medications, my wallet. I moved on autopilot, trying not to think about what I was doing or why. I locked the apartment door and drove across town to my friend Sarah's house in Squirrel Hill. It was early evening, still light outside. I told her I thought there might be a gas leak, and I didn't feel safe staying there. She didn't ask too many questions. The next morning, I filed a police report. The officer was young and patient. He took notes, looked at my photographs, and said he'd file it as a breaking and entering. Then he did something that made my blood go cold. He pulled up his computer and started searching the city database for my address. "That's odd," he said after a moment. "What? Your unit?" he said, turning the screen slightly toward me. "It's listed as vacant. Has been since January." I stared at the screen. There was my address, my unit number, and in the status field vacant. 2 months. "That doesn't make sense," I said. "I live there. I've been paying rent." The officer frowned and made a note. "We'll look into it," he said. "But you should probably contact your landlord about that discrepancy." I haven't been back to the apartment. Sarah says I can stay as long as I need to. The landlord finally called me back on Monday, and when I asked him about the holes and the new ventilation work, there was a long silence on the line. "I don't know anything about that," he said. "I haven't authorized any work in your unit. I'm still trying to figure out what that means. Why someone would drill holes in my walls. Why the building records say I don't live there. Why the chemical smell is still on my clothes, even after washing them twice." Story number 2, mud season. I started noticing the tire tracks about a week into March, when the snow had finally retreated enough to leave the driveway a mess of mud and standing water. They were fresh each morning, deep tread marks that curved into my turnaround spot near the mailbox, then reversed back out toward the road. I figured it was delivery trucks. The dirt road dead ends a 1/4 mile past my property, so it makes sense that drivers would use my place to turn around rather than backing up for 1/2 mile. I'm retired now, been home most days. Meteorology is just a hobby, but I keep detailed logs of temperature and precipitation, so I was outside anyway, checking the rain gauge in the sky. The tracks became part of my morning routine. I'd get my coffee, step out onto the porch, and look at them while the cup warmed my hands. Same tread pattern every time, same stopping point. Always reversed before reaching the house itself. By the second week, I could have drawn them from memory. On a Tuesday morning, I smelled diesel exhaust lingering near the mailbox. The thaw had brought that rich, wet earth smell, soil waking up, but underneath it was something sharp and chemical. I checked my watch. It was 7:30, 5 in the morning. The smell was maybe an hour old, maybe less. I stood there for a while, holding my coffee, thinking about the timing. The mail doesn't come until afternoon. No reason for a delivery truck to be here this early. I told myself it was probably someone turning around before dawn, before I was awake. The smell just carried longer in the cool air. That made sense. But I started looking more carefully at the tracks, measuring them mentally. They seemed narrower than a delivery truck's axle width, more like a sedan or a small SUV. I didn't mention this to anyone. I wasn't even sure why I was keeping track. On Friday of that week, I followed the tracks on foot instead of just observing them from the porch. I wanted to see where they came from, if they continued down the road or turned in from somewhere else. The mud was soft enough to walk in without sinking, and the tracks were clear. I followed them backward, away from my mailbox, and about 50 yards into the property, they veered sharply left, toward the tree line. The trees were still mostly bare. It's early spring in Vermont, just starting to green, so I could see where the ground had been disturbed. Compressed mud, flattened brush. Someone had driven in there, parked, and gotten out. I pushed through the branches and found the spot. A small clearing, maybe 10 feet across, where someone had been sitting. Cigarette butts scattered in the mud. At least a dozen of them, maybe more. The ground was packed down from repeated visits. I stood in that clearing and looked back toward my house. I could see directly into my kitchen window. I could see the living room. The angle was perfect. From here, someone could watch me move through my morning routine. Watch when I made coffee. Watch when I sat down to read the paper. Watch when I went upstairs. My chest tightened. I'm not an anxious person. I spent 27 years a postal worker in a city before I retired out here, and I've never been the type to jump at shadows. But standing in that clearing, I felt the weight of being observed. Not right then. The clearing was empty, but regularly, systematically. I went back inside and called the hardware store in town. I bought 3 trail cameras. Cheap ones, battery, powered, motion activated. I set them up that afternoon, one pointing at the driveway entrance, one at the mailbox, one aimed at the tree line clearing. Then I went to my truck, loaded my shotgun, and parked it at an angle where I could see the driveway entrance without being visible from the road. I spent 3 nights in that truck, uncomfortable nights. The cab was cold, and I kept the windows down so I could hear anything approaching. Nothing came. The driveway stayed empty. The mailbox undisturbed. By the 4th morning, I was starting to feel foolish. Maybe I'd misread the situation. Maybe the tracks had a simple explanation, and I'd let my imagination run away. I checked the trail cameras. The 4th camera, the one on the driveway, had captured motion at 3:15 in the morning. I scrolled through the images on the small screen, my hands steady but my breathing not. A vehicle pulled in. It was a county maintenance truck, the kind the highway department uses. But the license plate was covered with something dark, tape or paint. The driver got out, and I could see clearly enough a man in his 50s, maybe, wearing a postal service jacket, not a county uniform, not maintenance wear. A postal service jacket, dark blue with the USPS logo visible even in the infrared image. I've worn that jacket for 27 years. I know what it looks like. He walked to my mailbox, opened it, looked inside, closed it. Then he stood there for maybe 30 seconds, looking at my house. Just looking. Then he got back in the truck and drove away. I called the sheriff that morning. I showed him the images. I described the clearing in the woods. I told him about the tracks and the smell of diesel and the timing. He listened carefully, which I appreciated. He said he'd look into it. He asked if I recognized the vehicle or the man. I didn't. He asked if I'd had any disputes with neighbors, or if anyone had reason to watch my property. I said no. He called me back 2 days later. The vehicle description didn't match anything in the county fleet. No maintenance trucks with covered plates. No postal workers assigned to this route who fit the description. He said it was possible someone was using a stolen or repurposed vehicle, but without a clear plate number or a better image of the driver's face, there wasn't much they could do. He suggested I keep the cameras running and call if anything else happened. Nothing else happened. The tracks stopped appearing. The clearing in the woods stayed empty. I checked it twice, and the cigarette butts were still there, but no fresh ones. No new compressed mud. That was 3 weeks ago. I still check my mailbox every morning. I still look at the driveway. The cameras are still running, and I review the footage every few days. Nothing. Just empty driveway, empty road, empty woods. But I know someone was here. Someone watched my routine. Someone wore a jacket like the one I wore for most of my adult life, and they came in the dark to look at my house. I don't know why. I don't know if they're coming back. The sheriff couldn't find them, and I can't stop thinking about the fact that they knew exactly where to park to see into my windows. They knew my property. They knew my schedule. Every morning, I still get my coffee. I still step out onto the porch. I still look at the driveway. But now I'm also looking at the tree line, and I'm wondering if someone is looking back. Story number 3, Conference Badge. I was halfway through my presentation on cardiovascular drug interactions when I noticed him in the back row. Vendor badge clipped to his chest, the kind they hand out at the registration table. I didn't think much of it then. The conference room was overheated, the air thick with coffee, and that particular smell of synthetic carpet that convention centers all seem to have. I was focused on my slides, on the regional managers scattered throughout the audience, on the fact that this presentation mattered. I'd been promoted 3 months ago, and Columbus was one of my first major conferences in the new role. After I finished, I was gathering my materials when he approached. He was tall, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of neutral expression people wear when they're trying to seem professional. He asked about my work, which was normal. Then he asked where I was staying. I said the Hilton, which was obvious since that's where the conference hotel was. He asked if I drove to these events or flew. I remember thinking it was an odd question, the kind of thing someone asks when they don't quite understand how networking works. I gave him a vague answer about it depending on the distance and excused myself to the next session. I didn't recognize him then. That's what bothers me most about this, I think, that I didn't know. That evening I went to the hotel gym. I needed to move, to burn off the nervous energy that comes with presenting. The gym was mostly empty, just me and a few other people on the machines. I was on the elliptical, watching the news on the mounted television, when I noticed him in the mirror wall across the room. He was on a treadmill. He wasn't running. He was standing still, one hand on the rail, watching me in the reflection. Not looking at the television or his phone or anything else, just watching. I told myself it was coincidence. People stay at the same hotel. People use the gym. He was probably just tired, resting between intervals. I finished my workout and went back to my room, but I locked the door and checked the chain. I told myself I was being paranoid. The next morning at the breakfast buffet, I saw him again. He was 3 tables away, sitting alone, his phone in front of him. His posture was odd, though. The phone was angled, and I realized he was pointing it toward me. Not obviously. Not in a way that would be immediately noticeable to anyone else, but angled. I felt my stomach tighten. That's when something clicked. The face. The way he held himself. Derek Hartley. He'd worked in our Columbus office 2 years ago, in the same department. He'd been fired for harassment. Multiple complaints from women in the office. I remembered the meetings, the way management had handled it quietly, the relief when he was gone. I didn't finish eating. I went back to my room, packed my bag, and checked out early. I told the front desk I had a family emergency. It wasn't a lie, exactly. It was an emergency, just not a family one. The parking garage was dim and cool. The kind of place that always feels slightly wrong, no matter what time of day it is. My rental car was on the 3rd level. As I approached it, I saw him standing about 4 spaces down, near a silver sedan. He was looking at his phone, but his body language was all wrong. He wasn't searching for his car. He was waiting. When he saw me, he looked up, smiled slightly, and walked away without saying anything. Just walked past me toward the elevator. I froze for a moment, my hand on my car door. Then I turned around and walked back to the lobby. The security guard at the desk was a woman in her 50s named Patricia. I told her what was happening. I told her about Derek, about the gym, about the breakfast area, about the parking garage. I expected her to minimize it, to tell me I was overreacting. Instead, she called another guard, and they both walked me back to my car. Derek was nowhere in sight. They waited while I got in and started the engine, and they watched me drive toward the exit. I didn't go to the airport. I drove to the nearest police station, a brick building about 5 miles from the hotel. The officer who took my statement was professional and kind, but his words were careful. Without direct threats, without physical contact, without explicit statements about intent, there wasn't much they could do. He filed a report. He gave me a case number. He told me to call if anything escalated, if Derek made contact, if anything else happened. I left the station and drove toward the highway. I was thinking about calling my manager, about whether I should file something with HR, about whether I should contact the conference organizers. I was thinking about all of this when I pulled away from the curb and noticed something under my windshield wiper. It was my rental car agreement. The one I'd left in the glove compartment. The one that had been locked inside my car. My home address was circled in blue pen. I sat in the car for a long time staring at that paper. The engine was running. My hands were on the wheel. I didn't drive away. I didn't go back into the police station. I just sat there, trying to understand what I was looking at, trying to understand what it meant that someone had opened my car, found my documents, and marked my address. Eventually I drove. I took the highway north toward home, toward the address that was now circled in blue. I kept checking my mirrors. The road was normal. The traffic was normal. Everything looked exactly as it should, but something had changed. Some invisible line had been crossed. And I understood, in a way that made my chest tight, that filing a report and driving home wasn't going to be the end of this. It was just the beginning of something I didn't have words for yet. The highway stretched ahead of me, empty and familiar and completely raw.